Hi, in this tutorial, we're going to be going over multiplying and dividing radicals. So in this tutorial, you'll learn how to multiply square roots, how to simplify square roots, how to use the quotient root for square roots, and how to use the product and quotient rules for other roots. So here's the product root for square roots. The product of two square roots is the square root of the product of the radicands. So here, if we have the square root of a times the square root of b, well, that's just the square root of a times b. Now the square root of a product is the product of the square roots. So here, if we have the square root of a times b, well, that's just the square root of a times the square root of b. So let's do an example. Use the product rule for square roots to find the product of the square root of 11 times the square root of 7. So here we have the square root of 11 times the square root of 7. So that's just the square root of 77. Now, the third nth square root of 4 times the third nth square root of 2 is the third nth square root of 8. Because 4 times 2 is 8. And then the third square root of 8 is 2, because 2 cubed equals 8. Now, simplifying square roots is when a square root is simplified when its radicand has no factors other than 1 that are perfect squares. So here we have the square root of 500 can be broken down into the square root of 100 and the square root of 5. Well, the square root of 100 is just 10, and then we just multiply that by the square root of 5. So simplifying square roots with variables to even powers is the square root of a variable raised to an even power equals the variable raised to 1/2 that power. So here, if we have square root of x raised to the 2nth power, well, that's just x to the nth power. If you just multiply that by 1/2. So 1/2 of 2n is just n. So here's an example. The square root of x to the 10 is just x to the 5 because 1/2 times 10 is 5. So simplifying square roots with variables to odd powers, you're going to want to express the variable as the product of two factors, one of which has an even power. So here, if we have the square root of x to the 5, we're going to break that down so that one of them has an even variable. So here we have the square root of x to the 4 times the square root of x to the 5. Well, the square root of x to the 4th is x squared times x. So let's do an example. Let's simplify the square root of 63. Well, we can break that down into the square root of 9 times the square root of 7. Well, the square root of 9 is 3, so all we have is we multiply that by the square root of 7. So that's our answer. So now here we have the square root of x to the 26, so we multiply that by half. So 26 divided by 2 equals 13. So that means this equals x to the 13th power. So let's do that again. We have square root x to the 26. 26 divided by 2 is 13. So that means x equals, so that means that this equals x to the 13th power. So now let's evaluate the square root of x to the 27th power. So we're going to want to break that down so one of them is an even number. So we can break that down into x to the 26 times x. Well, we know that 26 divided by 2 is 13. So this equals x to the 13th power times the square root of x. So now let's evaluate the square root of 4x cubed. So here we have square root of 4x cubed. We're going to break that down so that we get 4x squared times x. So now we have the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of x, 2 divided by 2 is 1, so we have x, 2x, times the square root of x. Now let's evaluate the square root of 8 times the square root of 3. So that's the square root of 24. And then we can break this down into the square root of 6 times 4. Because 6 times 4 is 24. So we know that the square root of 4 is 2 times the square root of 6. So that's our answer. Now the quotient rule for square roots states that the quotient of two squares is the square root of the quotient of the radicands. So the square root of a divided by the square root of b is equal to the square root of a over b. And then the square root of a quotient is the quotient of the square roots. So the square root of a over b is equal to the square root of a divided by the square root of b. So let's do an example. Here we have the square root of 36 over x squared. Well, that's the same as the square root of 36 over the square root of x squared. So we know the square root of 36 is 6. And then, since this is a 2 power, 2 divided by 2 multiplied by 1/2 equals 1. So we know the square root of x squared is just x. So that's our answer. So now here we have the third nth root of 2 divided by 125. So that's the same as third nth root of 2 divided by the third nth root of 125. So now we know the third nth root of 125 is 5 because 5 cubed is 125. And then here we have third nth root of 2. So that's our answer. Now let's simplify the square root of 50 times x to the 4th divided by the square root of 2. So here we're going to want to break down 50. We could break it down into 2. And then here we're going to want to break that down to x times 25, because 25 times 2 is 50. And then here we have it. We can break that down to x squared times x. So now if we add them up as x squared plus x, we get x to the 4th. All over 2x. So now we can cross out like terms. So now we get the square root of 25 x squared times x. And then the square root of 25 is 5. And then 2x squared, the square root of x squared is 2 divided by 2 is 1. So we get 5x divided by, I multiply the square root of x. So that's our answer. So in this tutorial, you'll learn how to multiply square roots, how to simplify square roots, how to use the quotient rule for square roots, and how to use the product and quotient rules for other roots. Now try and solve problems in our multiplying and dividing radicals workbook. For more help, sign up for online tutoring. And in the next video, we're going to be going over operations with radicals. Thank you.